Hi again, back with another lecture. This time we're drilling down further and further from the high-level circulation, the flow through major vessels, and we're going to drill down now to the layer of the microcirculation. So remember this diagram you've seen before that shows this kind of high-level view of the entire circulatory system in the body, and we're going to focus now on those capillary beds, because as we've said before, that's where all the real delivery, we've called it, action is. This is where all the movement of ions across membranes, the movement of gases in and out of the lungs, all that stuff really happens. We've got to drill down to that level before we really can begin to understand how that system functions in practice and how we regulate it, what the regulatory aspects of that system are. So a core idea here will be the fluid balance. And by that, we're going to mean the liquid, the water literally, that is balanced between what's in the circulation and what's outside of the circulation. Because that's the two compartments in which water lives, and it has a number of forces that will push it out or pull it out, and we'll see that in a sec, anyway, how it all balances out. And we'll throw in a little bit about the lymphatics, the lymph system. It's a really important component of circulatory system, and you know, we'll see at the end how it plays, for example, a big role in high altitude pulmonary edema, which you hopefully remember you heard about in the video about the party that climbed Everest and one of the challenges of being at high altitude. So let's dive into this. As usual, structure first, then function. This is just a review to remind us that we're now down in this domain, not so much of the aorta artery, the left side, but the right side of this figure where we're down in the arterioles, the capillaries, the venules, those really small vessels. You see the scale here is micron scale, and that's the space that we're going to have a look at now. And again, from a high level perspective, just to put it all in more context, we have the transport, I called it before, which is the big veins and arteries, and then we drill down and we think about delivery. So you can picture this as kind of an interstate on the one hand, transporting large volumes of traffic in that case, but none of that traffic actually does any good. It just fills up the interstates. People are not actually getting into their cars, out of their cars. Materials in trucks are not being actually loaded up or taken to the consumer or to the retailer or wherever it has to go. So that happens in the finer scale when we get into the small streets and actually deliver things to those homes and neighborhoods. And we're going to talk about this delivery system right now. Again, from a structural perspective, this is a nice image. I kind of like this one because it really shows the two sides of the system, the arterial side and the venous side, and in between this very, very dense, very small, but very dense and extensive network of capillaries. And we go, of course, stepwise down. The arterioles, 40 microns or so in diameter, and then we see some other really important structural details. If we look where the arterioles go into the capillaries, in between there are these precapillary sphincters. A sphincter is a muscle that squeezes an opening of some sort of tube of some sort, and this is where, as we'll see in a little bit, the overwhelmingly important aspect of control of the flow of blood into this system actually occurs. It's through these sphincters at this location. And then as we get deeper down into this system, as you remember, structurally, we're just dealing with endothelial layers. There's no more control, there's no more muscle, there's no fibrous tissue, there's almost no elasticity except what's sort of natively there in the very deformable epithelial layers. And we'll describe more epithelial layers in just a sec. Capillaries come amazing numbers here. There are 10 billion or so, give or take, in the body. It's kind of amazing. Total surface area is 500 to 700 square meters. That's a big area. I mean, that's a 7,000 square foot home, right? It's the equivalent of that. So that's a large surface area. Another key factor, or key factoid, if you will, is that within the body, we're never much further than about 30 microns from any cell to a capillary. So that means that diffusion, which is the last step in the process of delivering oxygen or nutrients to the tissues, that has to play out only over a very short distance. And we know diffusion works well at short distances, but it's slow. This is why the circulatory system is so important because it moves, like the interstate system, it moves large volumes to where it's needed, and then it gets distributed or really delivered to the actual tissues of interest. And of course, the other direction when the body is getting rid of byproducts it doesn't need. So it's an amazingly extensive, amazingly dense system. We'll see photographs later where individual capillaries are flowing through individual cardiac myocytes, for example, individual cardiac cells. So it's an incredibly dense network. It's really hard to get a good feeling for how extensive the capillaries are. And even in our anatomy lab, we don't have anything like the resolution to see capillaries. We're only seeing very large vessels at that point. Even any of these vessels are too small, for us to see in that setting. So again, on the opposite side of this system, we have the venous side, the venules, and they get progressively bigger and bigger and move the blood, of course, back in toward the heart. The capillary wall structure, as I said, is very simple, endothelial layers, but as usual, even a cell has a lot of complexity. There's organelles, there's lots of different elements of its function that are, of course, incredibly important. And then what we also see, if we look at this image here, is that there are junctions in between the individual endothelial cells. Those junctions can be tight junctions, loose junctions, all sorts of variability. We'll touch on that in a second. But the important part to note is that we have a structure made of just a single cell layer, but it's not one cell. These are multiple individual cells that together form a monolayer or a single cell layer that determine the opening, the actual capillary through which things can flow. In this image, you also see a erythrocyte, which is a red blood cell, just to put, again, some size perspective on this. So we're down the realm where these vessels are about the size of a red blood cell, sometimes even smaller, in which case the red blood cell or erythrocyte has to deform to make it through. But that's sort of the scale we're at. Now we'll get, like I say, we'll get into a few of these different subtypes here. So one type here is in which we have what's called a continuous capillary. So these are capillaries in which the junctions are tight, the cells are packed in closely together, and the result is a fairly impenetrable capillary. This is not a leaky, this is kind of the other extreme. This is the blood-brain barrier type capillary that lets very little pass through it. So there's very little delivery possible from or between the blood supply in the capillaries and the surrounding tissues. It's not completely tight, of course, but anything larger, will no longer make it through. And here you see sort of generically the structure of this continuous capillary. So again, very tight junctions, very impenetrable, relatively impenetrable membrane. Now in other parts of the body, other organ systems, we have what's called a fenestrated capillary. So here we have larger opening, these fenestrations or pores that exist between the individual endothelial cells, and they can be even large enough to let a red blood cell sort of squeeze its way through. They're on that sort of scale of 10 microns, something in that range, or sorry, not that big, sort of 1 micron, sometimes opening, so they can let things through. So these are fenestrated capillaries, sort of middle ground. They're observed in a number of different parts of the body, and there we get them, for example, in the bone marrow. Kidneys have a few of these. Some of the GI tract system is this way. So here we can imagine some delivery happening. Here there's an easier flow of the substances we need to deliver across these particular capillaries. Now we get a sinusoidal capillary, which is even a larger opening. So this is the most porous of all the different capillaries. And these are typical of what we would see in the liver, the bone marrow, lymph nodes, for example. They have a lot of ability to allow large molecules even, which is of course essential, for example, for the response of the immune system. This is why lymph nodes play a key role in the immune system. We'll come back to the lymph system later on. But this is a very porous situation where there's a fairly free movement of a lot of the molecules of interest for us in the physiological setting. Now that's the barrier that we have, the capillaries themselves, and we know what's inside, that's blood with all its constituents. And now the question is what's outside the capillaries. This is the interstitial space or interstitium. And it's a gel-like fluid. It has some fibrous areas. I've heard it described as like a brush pile, if that means anything, like the pile of a carpet. That is made of this, largely collagen, other fibrous materials, in which kind of a gel-like substance is bound. So there's some free movement of particles, even larger particles. There's water movement that will go along edges. It will follow along some of these filaments. So there's almost like water channels through this medium, which is otherwise, not so conducive to certainly large amounts of water flow. Again, at least in general. These are all generalizations with variability across different parts of the body. And so there's a fair amount of transport that can happen, of delivery, that can happen across this area. And so now there are something like 12 liters of it in the body. So there's a great deal of volume of this. And it does play an important role. It sometimes has even negative pressure, negative static pressure, or hydrostatic pressure that tends to hold it together, that tends to keep it as a gel so it doesn't dissolve and turn into a liquid. There are free liquids, as I say. There are free channel water channels that flow through it that give some additional ability for certain things to be moved around. Another context in which you might come across interstitial spaces, and let me help you understand what these spaces are, is in architecture, interestingly enough. So this is an example from a building with a cross-sectional diagram of the floors of the building, and you see that there are individual floors, and in between those individual floors are the interstitial spaces. I didn't make this up. This is apparently used in architecture. So these are the spaces in between the functional zones, right? A room, you could say, is like a cell, or like the blood, or some other functional, useful space in the room. And yet we need these interstitial spaces in practice, of course, to house infrastructure, plumbing, electricity, wiring, that sort of thing, air ducts. But it has, in some abstract way, kind of a similar overall function, and it sits between the capillaries and the endothelial layers in the capillaries, and the other cells of whatever system that we're talking about, the individual cardiac myocytes, if you're talking about a cardiac piece of tissue or piece of the heart, or the space between skeletal muscle cells, if you're talking about a skeletal muscle. So this is, again, a fairly large volume, 12 liters, of fluid, or gel-like fluid, that is distributed throughout the body. So just be aware that's always there. Well, not always, nothing is always. It's usually there, and the exception cases are when it's not there. And there are some important exceptions that we'll get to a little later. But in general, interstitial space is available, it is there, and it plays a role in this ability to drop off or pick up molecules, gases, whatever we need to move around in the body. So now let's talk about the actual delivery process. How does that work? So we're talking here about delivery from the capillaries or to the capillaries, and we'll start with water balance. Water seems like a good substance to keep track of. We'll see why throughout this talk, actually. But more generally, diffusion is also variable across the capillaries, of course, in part driven by the organization of the endothelial cells, as I showed you, these different examples of continuous versus very, very penetrated or fenestrated capillary walls. That obviously plays a role. That determines the resistance, one aspect of the resistance to this diffusion. And again, this is another one of these mechanisms that we can describe as a flux being the product of a gradient divided by resistance, or the product of a gradient times an enabling function, a permeability in this case. This is where we could use permeability instead of resistance. One is just the inverse of the other. We'll see that again and again in many systems. So different materials will have different permeabilities. So even in the same endothelial structures, the same segment or type of capillary, we will see certain substances will move easily and certain substances less easily. And so we'll see, for example, lipid-soluble molecules like oxygen, CO2, they almost always move easily. Again, being lipid-soluble, they can go through membrane walls, so they can sometimes cross, not necessarily between the individual endothelial cells, but can cross the membranes of those endothelial cells and make their way into or out of the region of interest. Of course, the driver here is the gradient of concentration of whatever substance we're talking about. So if there's a high concentration of oxygen in the blood compared to the surrounding tissue, then that oxygen will leave the blood and move into the surrounding tissue. CO2, if it builds up in the surrounding tissue as it does during exercise or normal metabolism, that CO2 will have a gradient that causes it to want, at least, to move from the interstitial space into the capillaries. And both those are very mobile, so they can move across very easily. And as we get to larger and larger molecules, of course, it becomes progressively more difficult. Water moves generally pretty easily through these gaps between the endothelial layers, and again, this is why we'll talk about water again. But if we have water-soluble molecules, the small ones move fairly easily. They're soluble, so they move with the water. The larger ones have a harder time. If something is a truly large molecule that isn't water-soluble, then it has the hardest time of all. So there's a scale that we have, of course, and this is captured in the permeability. That's the term and ultimately the quantitative value that we can use in that simple equation of flux being a gradient times a permeability in this case. So there's a concept we have to bring in here that adds to the complexity of delivery across an endothelial layer, across a capillary, in the context of a moving supply of blood. So no longer do we have, or can we not picture, this supply of materials being in the capillary only and static with all the time necessary to establish equilibrium and to transport, but rather a system in which things are flowing by. So this would be the difference between the delivery truck parking outside your home and moving things in and out as needed, like a moving truck would, compared to the delivery of a newspaper, where the person is either walking by, the person delivering the newspaper is either walking by or riding by, and hopefully being able to throw off and deliver those newspapers quickly enough to get rid of them all as they ride their bikes by. Because if they ride more quickly than they can throw them off the bike, then the delivery will be incomplete. So these are two different scenarios that do play out in our bodies. They play out much more in the respiratory system in terms of gas delivery. And that's the example we'll use here, but they fundamentally apply to all types of delivery in the capillaries. And that is the difference between what we call diffusion-limited delivery and perfusion-limited or flow-limited delivery. Now, in a diffusion-limited situation, there the rate of diffusion, which we see varies based on the type of molecule that we're trying to deliver, when the diffusion is relatively slow and the material is moving by quickly, then there's not enough time for that diffusion to establish or allow an equilibrium to be established. So before that delivery can occur, the blood has moved along. This is the paper person who is riding more quickly than they should be and can't get the papers off the bike fast enough. And so at the end of the street, they have papers on their bike still that should have been delivered but couldn't be delivered because they're riding too quickly. That's diffusion limited. The same occurs in physiology. Same occurs, for example, and you see it in this graph, where we're looking at gases in particular, and we have partial pressures of gases in the capillaries and in the alveoli. And again, we'll return to some of this in respiratory physiology, but you should be clear already on the concepts here. So we have alveolar gas levels and we have capillary gas levels. Now, the alveolar level you see is the top there. That's the number, that's the value that we hopefully will achieve within the capillaries. That will be complete transport. When that blue line can climb up and the capillary gas level can achieve that level in the alveoli. That's complete transport of the gas from the alveoli to the capillaries. But if the diffusion is slow, if you have diffusion-limited delivery, then that won't happen. The blue line will rise, but it'll never reach the level of the alveolar gas concentration or gas partial pressure. The other case is perfusion limited. In that case, the amount delivered is just a function of how much flow there is. So there's lots of time to, let's say, throw those newspapers off the moving bicycle or the delivery truck can stop in front of the home and make sure that everything gets delivered before it moves on to the next home. That's perfusion limited. When the ultimate equilibrium is quickly established, because diffusion is rapid, there's enough time for the diffusion to occur. And so here you see a blue curve that reaches in the capillaries that same level of partial pressure that exists in the alveoli, and we have a very quick equilibrium established. And so the alveolar gas level and the capillary gas level are the same, and their amount is determined only by how much can be delivered. So this is the situation where we have, for example, another example would be exercise, where when we need more oxygen delivered, we simply increase the rate of perfusion, the rate of flow, because the equilibrium will be quickly established. That oxygen will quickly move across from the alveoli to the capillaries, establish an equilibrium, and the ultimate delivery rate will be determined only by the rate of flow. And that's perfusion limited. And both these arise in different gases in the body, in physiology. So it's a concept we'll return to, but it also belongs here when we're thinking more generally about the effect of different rates of diffusion in the actual delivery process as a function also of the actual time available as that material is moving through the capillaries and is available for transport. And again, this can occur in either direction, transport from the capillaries to the surrounding interstitial space, or as here, where we're having transport from the alveolar gases into the capillaries. The fundamental mechanisms arise in both directions. So again, diffusion happens not just in a space, as we've seen it, diffusion happens across membranes. And if you go all the way back to Darcy's law, that also was generated or created or applied at least to situations in which there were membranes present. This goes back to fundamentals 2. And so that's a typical situation where you have diffusion through a membrane. And this plays out again in the body. So if you've never heard of Darcy's law, please look it up. It will be useful and fit into this discussion. So diffusion, very important part of this. Another important mechanism for water now, and we're going to focus a little more on water. Really important mechanism for water, of course, you've heard of this before, I'm sure, is osmotic pressure or osmotic gradients, or the movement of water seeking to create an equilibrium of particle density on either side of a boundary. So normally when we get exposed to this whole concept, we see a diagram that looks something like this one here, where we have a membrane in the middle, and that membrane has holes enough that are fine enough for water to go back and forth, but those spheres floating around inside don't make it back and forth. And so if we have a higher density or higher number of those particles on, let's say, the right-hand side, as you see it here, then water will move, if it can, will move down its sort of concentration gradient. I mean, osmosis can be framed as a diffusion type situation, but it's better to think of it, I think, as almost a pulling force, as almost like where there's high density of particles, there's a lot of attraction, a lot of pull for the water. And so the water will move across that barrier and, in fact, create an equilibrium, or seek to create an equilibrium in concentration of particles that will result in the level of water rising magically on one side of that barrier higher than it is on the other side. And the height of that difference, the level difference that you see there, ultimately is a function of the concentration difference and the hydrostatic pressure that difference in height actually creates. Because as the water rises on one level, it will push down more. It will tend to be pushing down on the right-hand side, and hence from right to left across the membrane, at the same time as it's being pulled in from left to right because of the particle concentration. The classic equilibrium situation, again, these are concepts I hope you're comfortable with, but if not, ask, and I can point you to resources. We talk a lot about these in fundamentals, so I hope that you feel pretty confident in them. So osmotic pressure, very important thing. So now we have diffusion as the delivery mechanism. We have osmotic pressure, let's say pushing water back and forth. And then we have actually hydrostatic pressure. So hydrostatic pressure, again, we know about, we just described it in the context of osmosis as being another aspect of pressure. This is a pressure you just get through squeezing something, as you can picture it that way, or the pressure that arises because, my head is higher than my feet. And so there's a column of blood that exists between my feet and my head, and the pressure down at my feet is probably going to be higher, or guaranteed to be higher here on Earth at least, while we're in a gravitational attraction, than the pressure in my head or higher parts of my body. So that's just hydrostatic pressure. Conceptually, it's pretty straightforward. And you've certainly heard of things like blood pressure, right? Blood pressure is the hydrostatic pressure. It's a form of hydrostatic pressure. So now we can start to imagine that there's a hydrostatic pressure inside the vessel, even inside the capillaries. Not big. Certainly, it's not like 120 like it was when the blood left the aorta, but it's still a larger than zero number. And then we can look in the interstitial space and say, oh, is there pressure there? Is there squeezing that's going on there? And of course, there's a static condition under which that occurs, and then there's a dynamic condition. So if I take my arm and squeeze it, and I squeeze that interstitial space, and I'm also squeezing indirectly the vessels, I'm disrupting that whole pressure profile. And that will change the balance, let's say, between these two forces, depending on how I squeeze, where I squeeze, what the tissue composition is, all sorts of things like that. So this is hydrostatic pressure. And we can measure it on the arterial side and of the capillary system. There we find it's maybe 30, 40 millimeters of mercury right at the very beginning of the capillaries. It's down to 10 or 15 on the venous side. It has to be more than zero, else the blood would never get back to our hearts, right? So there is a gradient of pressure across or along the capillary, right? So the pressure at the arterial end is going to be higher than the pressure at the venous end, and that's important. And then there's another change or difference in pressure between, or there may be, between the pressure inside the capillary and outside the capillary in the interstitial space. So again, this is where this flow component comes in, where there's pressure, more pressure on one side than the other, which is what causes flow. But the result of that is at the venous end of the capillaries, we have lower pressure inside the capillary than we do at the arterial end. We have to take that into account. The interstitial pressure tends to be small. There's not, you can sort of imagine why there's not a lot of pressure there. I mentioned it could be negative slightly, and for complicated reasons. But the point is that if we were able to measure pressure there, we'd say it might be 0 to maybe slightly negative values. So there's a pressure difference between the inside of the vessels and the outside that's going to drive water, because water is what follows that hydrostatic pressure gradient. We'll push water across that capillary wall or that endothelial layer. That's not the only game in town, though. I said there was osmotic pressure as well, and that's going to play a role as we think through this entire system. So sometimes we call this plasma colloid osmotic pressure. This colloid it comes about because of the colloidal nature. There's particles in the blood, and when there's particles, that creates an osmotic attraction for water, so to speak. And of course, the same is true in the interstitial space, where there are definitely particles. You can imagine particles floating around in there in various forms, suspension or whatever. And so both sides will have an osmotic pressure that will tend to pull water toward it. So in the blood, for example, you can imagine proteins, large proteins, they don't diffuse very well at all. They don't get through the capillaries at all. And they're particles, and they count as particles. And so these particles will cause an osmotic attraction of water into the capillaries. So just as there was hydrostatic pressure pushing water out, there's osmotic pressure pulling water into the capillaries. And so we have to do an accounting of all those various pressures. I like this figure because it shows how this sort of summarizes a number of things, and it describes how we have capillary pressures that vary along the distance. We have constant colloid osmotic pressures. They don't change so much along this segment between, let's say, the arterial side and the venous side of a little segment of capillary. And the balance between those pressures is what causes water to flow. And we will see that there's a net outflow of water on the arterial side, which makes some sense when you think, okay, the arterial side has higher capillary hydrostatic pressure inside compared to the venous side. So if we're going to have water flowing out, it's probably going to be at the arterial end of a capillary, and of course the opposite at the other end, where the pressure has dropped enough that there's flow back in. Now, we have terms for those that we'll use mostly in the renal system, but they're good terms to get comfortable with. So we have what's called filtration, So if you look at this diagram, you'll see net filtration of water flowing from the capillaries out into the interstitial space, and then net absorption of that water back into the capillaries in the venous end, or at the venous end of this segment of capillary. And these two, it turns out, are not perfectly balanced. So the net filtration is larger than the net absorption when we integrate it over the entire body. And this is, again, what we have to do to keep track of the whole body. And we find that there's a net flow from the blood to the interstitial space of about 3 liters a day. Again, this varies with all sorts of things, how much you exercise, how much fluid you drink, blah, blah, blah. But the point is that under normal circumstances, when a body is well hydrated, there's a net outflow of that water. And guess what? Where do you think the water ends up? In that kidney that we examined in the dissection lab, and leaves our kidney in the form of urine. So this balance leads to urine production and a certain amount, again, 3 liters a day, that seems a little high, but it's somewhere in that ballpark. Half a liter to 3 liters depends on a lot of factors. The point is that we have a net outflow that starts, its origins of this are at the capillaries, and yet its final effect is in our urine that we produce, a very sort of whole body phenomenon. And we'll see this again and again in the body, how these small factors, local factors, can affect the whole body. We can go through this calculation numerically with some estimated values, and you can kind of imagine that measuring these things is not straightforward. We could spend a lot of time describing and talking about how those measurements get made in a modern day lab, but you can already imagine it's not trivial to imagine, what is the pressure in the interstitial space. There are ways to do it. It's not impossible. Engineers play a big role in creating those techniques, but we don't have time to get into that. The bottom line is, the point is, when you add it all up, that there is a net outward pressure of 0.3 millimeters of mercury, which doesn't seem like much, right? Seems pretty close to 0, but that is enough to produce this 2 milliliters per minute of net outflow in our tissues, and ultimately contributes to that, again, 3 liters roughly of urine that we produce per day. So that's the water balance that plays out inside our bodies at the capillaries. It's a big part of the delivery system. This is how water gets delivered, if you will, from the capillaries to the interstitial spaces and ultimately to the cells that surround them. And there's an ongoing back and forth of this water, and we'll talk in the next lecture about how that's regulated. Because as we all know, when we eat a lot of potato chips, somehow magically we don't seem to need to urinate as much. And when we drink a lot of liquid, certain types of liquid more than others, will tend to produce more urine. And so we'll get to all these topics through the course of this semester. But the key thing here, and this is why I wanted to start at the scale, is it really does play out at a very small scale, at micron scale organs of the vasculature. So a brief word about the lymphatic system. We should talk about that. So parallel to the vascular system, arteries, veins, blah, 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 all that good stuff, is another system called the lymphatic system. And lymph is a liquid. It's a mix of proteins and water and sort of a goop, if you will, that exists, in the interstitial spaces. And when there's enough of it, it creates a gradient, and it flows through very porous, very leaky layers of endothelial cells into this parallel lymphatic system. It's like another set of tubes that exists throughout our body. Very floppy, very loose, very thin-walled. There's very little or to no active regulation of the lymph system. It's a pretty passive system with a limited capacity to pick up the extra water. We'll come back to that in just a sec. So it's incredibly important. The limbs pick up all kinds of debris from our body, the large particles, the things that won't go into the vasculature, for example. You get an injury and there's lots of debris from that injury. That debris has to be removed somehow, and it won't get into the blood supply, but it will pass into these lymph ducts and lymph nodes eventually. This is where it all gathers together from the individual lymph vessels. It gathers in these nodes, which is why when you have an infection, for example, and you're producing an immune response that's generating a lot of this debris, you get swollen lymph nodes, right? Everybody's presumably had this observation. If not, try it the next time you're sick, and I hope you don't get sick. But if you do get sick, just feel your lymph nodes, and they gather in certain parts of the body, underneath the armpit, around the neck, at the groin area. Those are the three major ones. You can see there's a diagram here that actually shows schematically sort of where they're all gathered. Those lymph nodes are concentrated areas where a lot of lymph vessels flow together and come into these nodes, these sort of nodules or larger volumes. And then eventually this does flow back into the circulatory system and can be processed by the body. But the lymph system brings it from the extremities back into the body. Now, you've probably heard of edema that arises. You may have even known somebody, unfortunately, let's say, who's had lymph nodes removed for cancer, for example. This is where cancer cells can grow, where cell proliferation can happen. It's a good environment for that. So these lymph nodes can swell, and they're sometimes surgically removed. And when people don't have functioning lymph nodes or otherwise compromised lymph systems, then they get too much of this lymphatic fluid building up in their tissues that can't be drained properly. And that's edema. And that causes swelling. This is again, very typical that you see this kind of swelling in people who've lost their lymph nodes. So it does play an amazingly important function. The movement of the lymph is also mediated by muscle movement, just us moving around and contracting our muscles. We're squeezing those lymph vessels and moving things along them. There are even little valves in those lymph vessels that stop the lymph fluid from going back upstream, so to speak. So if they get squeezed, it will always head toward the heart, and these valves will stop it from returning back upstream. So it's a pretty amazing system. Here's another image I like that shows this fluid balance that includes the vasculature. So here you see this net filtration on the arterial side of the capillary segment. You see sort of in the middle of this diagram, and a net absorption on the venous side where it's blue, but then intertwined and parallel to this is the lymph systems. So that extra liquid that leaves through the net filtration, some of that gets picked up in the lymph vesicles or vessels and then brought back to the heart that way. So this really is important. It's one of the unsung heroes of our system, and it works quietly and usually very well until it doesn't, and then it can lead to really unpleasant consequences for people. But in this figure here, you see that it will increase for relatively small changes in pressure. So this PT here, this is the pressure in that system. And within a small amount of interlymphatic pressure, that system maxes out. So the flow rate quickly goes up to 20 something and then reaches its limit. And this is important because if we have conditions that exceed that pressure, for example, because we have a lot of lymph production or a lot of water leaking into the interstitial space, then the lymph system has a very limited capacity, or at least when it reaches that limited capacity, it basically does not add much. This does not increase dramatically for a long period of time. It's dramatically across a short range of pressures. And that becomes really important when it comes to thinking about a disease you've read about called pulmonary edema. So pulmonary has to do with the lungs. Edema is when the liquid leaves the vasculature, cannot be picked up and removed by the lymphatics. So that net filtration that we talked about, that occurs, but it occurs at such a high rate that the lymphatic system can't absorb it. So here's the schematically. You see a capillary on the left is hydrostatic pressure, osmotic pressure, all those various pressures. There is a net flow from the capillary to the interstitial space. So you see that black arrow at the bottom. That flow here creates a inflow into the lymphatic pump, they're calling it here, the lymphatic system, and that all goes well as long as that lymphatic system can keep up with the outflow of that water. However, when it doesn't, then we get a buildup of water in those tissues. Now, if this were an extremity, an arm or a foot, we just get swelling. And it would be uncomfortable, unpleasant, maybe even a little painful, would not be fatal. Wouldn't be a terrible thing. What can happen, however, in the pulmonary, this is why it's pulmonary edema, in the pulmonary system, those vessels are very close to the walls of the alveoli. And we'll spend some time later talking about alveoli, how they're structured, all that good stuff. But the alveoli are another very thin membrane that separates the air on the one side with the interstitial space or the very small space between the capillaries and the lungs. That's the boundary that's made there. Now, if the water pressure gets too large in that interstitial, that very small interstitial space, then the water has nowhere else to go once it exceeds the limits of the lymphatic system. So what it does is it goes across the walls of the alveoli. It breaks through these small pores that exist between the cells that make up that membrane of the alveoli. And water will then flow across. And if water flows across into the lungs themselves, then bad things happen. We had a conversation in the lab to talk a little bit about this, and we'll come back to it later in the context of the respiratory system. But it's not hard to imagine having some water flowing into your lungs is probably not going to be great for breathing, because that water will coat the alveolar layer, that membrane. It'll spread around that membrane, and it will block some of the oxygen or CO2 transport that should be happening across that very thin membrane. So this is why pulmonary edema happens, and this is why the lymph system is so important to ensuring that it doesn't happen. So this is where all these factors of transport and water balance and osmotic pressure and all these things really come together and explain a disease. And a lot of physiology has that appeal almost to it. It certainly has that purpose, that we can use physiology, the mechanisms of physiology, to explain diseases that otherwise are just a bunch of symptoms. And sometimes they're minor and sometimes they're major, like with pulmonary edema. Our jobs as physiologists is to keep asking, well, how does that happen? Why does that occur? What's the mechanism there? And then eventually, of course, to say, oh, how could we maybe alter that? How could we avoid it happening? And if it does happen, how could we reduce its impact? How could we apply some measure, whatever that is, to make things better? And that's the domain of pathophysiology. But we start with physiology when it's working well most of the time. So again, high altitude pulmonary edema, you heard about it in the video. It typically occurs, above 2,500 meters, which is not that high, right? I mean, that's well below what you'd find at the top of the Wasatch Mountains, or even at the ski resorts. So it can happen even at modest, relatively modest altitudes, and certainly as you go higher and higher up, it becomes worse and worse. So again, this loops around hopefully to show you how diving into the microvasculature allows us to explain a condition we heard about at the very macroscopic, very clinical scale in that video about climbing Everest. And this is, I think, a wonderful path to tread, which we'll do again and again throughout the semester as we dive into these various systems. So that's the story of the microcirculation. Next time, we'll come back and talk a little more about how it gets regulated, how it gets controlled, how other factors can influence that circulation and determine where the blood goes, for example. So stay tuned. See you soon in the next video, or you will see me soon in the next video. And thanks very much for your attention. Bye-bye. Bye-bye for now.